everyone, and welcome to our deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at WisdomTree.
WisdomTree.
Or WT, if you're looking at them on the stock exchange.
Right.
We've got a whole bunch of research and analysis, and we're going to try to figure out, what are the opportunities here? Are they a company worth investing in?
Yeah. Are there any risks that we need to think about?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, we want to give you that balanced perspective so you can make the best decision possible.
Absolutely.
So what's really cool about WisdomTree is that they're not like just an old school financial company. They've got this mix of traditional financial products like ETFs, and they've got these model portfolios for financial advisors. But then they're also doing some really, really interesting things with blockchain technology.
Yeah, that's a really important point, I think.
Like what?
Because having that diverse range of products really helps them adapt to the changing market conditions.
Oh, absolutely.
And that's crucial in today's world.
Yeah, it's like they're building a financial Swiss Army knife, right?
They're ready for anything.
That's a great analogy.
So speaking of being ready for anything, tell us a little bit about their blockchain initiatives, because this is where things get really, really interesting.
So they're doing things like blockchain-enabled mutual funds.
Okay.
They're working on tokenized assets.
Now, for someone who's not super familiar with that world, explain tokenized assets.
So basically, they're kind of like digital representations of real-world assets.
Okay.
So think, real estate or fine art.
So you could actually own like a tiny fraction of a skyscraper.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's about making investing more accessible,
That's amazing.
breaking down those barriers to entry. And it's a really revolutionary concept. And with all of these moves, WisdomTree is really positioning themselves at the forefront of this digital finance revolution.
It sounds like they're going all in on this.
Oh, yeah. They're not just dipping their toes in the water. Yeah. And they're not a small company. They're already managing a huge amount of money globally.
That's right. $99.5 billion as of January of this year.
So they're clearly doing something right. They're attracting investors, and they've built a really strong reputation, especially among people who like that dividend-focused strategy.
And speaking of which, they're not just limited to the U.S. market.
Oh, that's right. They're all over the world, aren't they?
They have a presence in North America, Latin America, Europe, and Asia.
So they're really planting seeds all over the globe.
Exactly. And, that global reach is important for a couple of reasons.
Okay, why is that?
Well, it means they're not completely dependent on any single economy.
It's a safety net, kind of?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And it also opens them up to a lot more growth opportunities, especially in those rapidly developing markets like Asia.
Makes sense, yeah. So you've got the safety net, but then you're also casting a wider net to catch more of those opportunities.
Precisely.
And I do want to touch on their dividend-focused strategy, because I know that was heavily influenced by Professor Jeremy Siegel.
Yeah, Professor Siegel has done a lot of research on this, and his work shows that over the long term, portfolios that are built around companies that pay dividends, they tend to outperform.
And that's really appealing to a lot of investors, I think.
Yeah, because everybody loves dividends.
Yeah, it's a way to kind of get a little bit of income from your investments as you go.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a very attractive approach. And it's even more interesting?
What's that?
Those dividend-paying companies tend to be more stable.
Well, yeah, they're the ones that are already really well established, right?
Exactly. They're not the risky startups. They're the ones that can kind of weather the storms.
Like that sturdy oak tree.
Yes, they're the sturdy oak trees in the market.
Yeah, they're not a delicate little flower that's going to wilt away at the first sign of trouble.
Right. And so they offer investors a certain level of stability, which can be very appealing in uncertain times.
So far, it sounds like a pretty rosy picture for WisdomTree.
Yeah,
But of course, with any investment, there's got to be some risks.
there are always risks.
So what are some of the things that we should be thinking about as potential investors?
Well, one of the biggest challenges that they face is the intensely competitive landscape of the financial world.
Oh, yeah, of course.
I mean, think about it. You've got giants like BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street.
Those are the big dogs.
They're the big dogs, and they have very, very deep pockets.
So how does a company like WisdomTree compete with those titans?
That's a great question, and I think that's where their focus on niche strategies really comes into play.
Okay, how so?
Well, instead of trying to be everything to everyone, they're really specializing in areas like those dividend-focused products and their blockchain-enabled offerings.
It's like opening a specialty bakery instead of trying to compete with a Walmart.
That's a perfect analogy.
Right. You find your niche, you become the expert,
Exactly.
and then people come to you for that.
And that expertise allows them to charge a premium
Oh, okay. So they're not just competing on price, they're competing on value and that specialized knowledge.
Precisely.
But even with a specialty focus, there's still that whole issue of fee compression.
Right, and that's a major concern for the entire asset management industry.
So explain fee compression for someone who might not be familiar with that term.
So basically, it's when competition forces asset managers to lower their fees.
Okay, so everybody's trying to undercut each other?
Exactly, and that can squeeze profit margins.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And it makes it harder to compete, especially with those big players who can afford to operate with much lower fees.
Because they've got that scale, right?
Exactly.
They can spread those costs out over a much larger base of assets.
So WisdomTree needs to find that sweet spot.
Right, where they're offering competitive fees, but also maintaining their profitability.
And then, of course, there's the whole regulatory landscape.
Oh, especially with those blockchain ventures.
Yeah, it's a bit of a wild west out there.
Right, it's such a new frontier.
It is, and regulators are still trying to figure out how to oversee it.
So how does WisdomTree approach that? Like, what are some of the specific challenges they're facing in that regulatory space?
One of the big concerns is the lack of clear guidelines around things like tokenized assets.
Okay.
So imagine they create this great platform for trading tokenized real estate, but then suddenly regulators decide to classify those tokens as securities.
Oh, that would change everything.
It would subject them to a whole new set of regulations and potentially disrupt their entire business model.
Right, it's like building a house and then suddenly the building codes change midway through construction.
Yeah, it's a moving target.
So how do you plan for that? How do you invest when you don't know what the rules of the game are going to be in the future?
That's a really tough question, and it's one of the biggest challenges that they face.
So they really have to be adaptable and nimble and ready to pivot.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hmm.
And I think the key is for them to be proactive,
Okay.
engaging with regulators, educating them about the technology, and demonstrating a commitment to compliance.
So they're not just waiting for the regulations to come down. They're actually trying to shape the conversation.
Exactly. They're trying to be part of the solution.
That's really interesting.
It's about building trust with regulators as much as with investors.
Yeah, because if investors see that they're playing by the rules, that's going to give them more confidence.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've talked about competition, we've talked about regulation, but what about market volatility? I mean, that's something that no investor can escape, right?
That's true. No investment is completely immune to market forces.
So how would an economic downturn impact a company like WisdomTree?
Well, their assets under management could decline.
And how would that affect their bottom line?
It would directly impact their fee revenue.
Right, because their fees are based on the assets they manage.
Exactly. And if their earnings take a hit, well, their stock price could follow suit.
So it's a chain reaction.
It is.
And even though they have that dividend focus, which offers some stability during downturns, they're still not immune to those broader market forces.
That's right. Diversification is always important.
Speaking of diversification, they do have that global reach.
Right.
So how might that play into their ability to manage risk?
Well, having a presence in multiple regions can definitely help them mitigate the impact of an economic downturn in any one region.
It's like a diversified portfolio, but on a company-wide level.
Exactly. If the U.S. market is struggling, their operations in Europe or Asia might offset some of those losses.
So they're not putting all their eggs in one basket.
And it also gives them access to different growth opportunities.
Makes sense. Yeah, so global diversification acts as both a shield and a sword.
I like that.
We did touch on some corporate governance issues earlier.
Right.
How much should potential investors be concerned about those?
Well, it's definitely something to keep an eye on.
Yeah.
You know, when you have conflicts between major shareholders and the board, it can be disruptive.
Right. Creates uncertainty.
Yeah. And it can raise questions about the stability of the leadership and the strategic direction of the company.
And I imagine it can also erode investor trust.
Absolutely. Because if investors feel like the company is not being well managed,
Yeah.
they might be hesitant to invest their money.
So it's not just about having a good product or a clever strategy.
Right.
It's also about having that solid foundation of good corporate governance.
Absolutely. Things like transparency, accountability, acting in the best interests of all shareholders.
So it really comes back to balancing innovation with stability.
Yeah. They need to be bold and ambitious, but also prudent and responsible.
They need to find that balance. 'Cause
Exactly.
that's a tightrope walk, for sure.
It is.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground already, but we're just getting started.
We're just scratching the surface.
Stay tuned. We'll be right back after a quick break.
Sounds good.
It sounds like they're really walking a tightrope between these cutting-edge blockchain things and, the realities of this super competitive market.
Yeah, it's a tough balancing act for sure.
So let's dig a little deeper into those risks that we were talking about before the break. We touched on fee compression, but how big of a threat is that really? Could it actually, push WisdomTree out of the game?
Well, it's definitely something to watch closely, especially when you're up against those giants like BlackRock, who can just afford to operate on these razor-thin
Right,
margins.
they've got the scale to do.
Exactly. But I actually think that WisdomTree's focus on those niche strategies could actually be their saving grace here.
Okay, how so?
Well, by specializing in areas like those dividend-focused products and the blockchain stuff, they're appealing to a very specific type of investor, right?
They're not trying to be everything to everyone.
Exactly. And these investors might be a little less sensitive to those small fee differences because they're really looking for that
You're kind of looking
expertise.
for a specialist.
Exactly. They want the best in those specific areas, and they're willing to pay a little extra for it.
So it's kind of like a boutique investment firm catering to a very discerning clientele.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. But even with a niche focus, they still have to deal with that whole regulatory landscape. And, we talked about how it's a bit of a wild west out there in the blockchain world.
Yeah, it's still very much the early days, and the rules are constantly changing.
So what are some of the specific challenges that they're facing when it comes to the regulatory side of their blockchain initiatives?
Well, one of the biggest things is just the lack of clear guidelines around things like tokenized assets.
Right.
I mean, imagine they create this amazing platform for trading tokenized real estate,
Okay.
and then suddenly regulators come in and say, oh, actually, we're going to classify those tokens as securities.
Oh, that'd be a nightmare.
It would be a huge headache because suddenly they'd be subject to this whole new set of regulations and potentially have to completely revamp their business model.
Yeah, like building a house and then halfway through the building inspector comes in and says, oh, you know what? All the building codes have changed. You got to start over.
It's a very uncertain environment, and it makes it really hard to plan for the future.
So how do you even invest when you don't know what the rules are going to be 6 months from now?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
And I think one of the most important things that WisdomTree can do is really try to be proactive in this space.
Okay, so what does that look like?
It means engaging with regulators, having conversations, educating them about the technology, and proving that they're committed to compliance.
So they're not just sitting back and waiting for the regulations to come down. They're actually trying to be a part of the process.
Exactly. They're trying to help shape the future of blockchain regulation.
That's really interesting. So it's about building that trust with regulators just as much as they're building trust with investors.
Absolutely. Because if investors see that WisdomTree is taking compliance seriously and working with regulators,
Yeah.
that's going to give them a lot more confidence.
Okay, so we've talked about competition, we've talked about regulation, but we can't forget about market volatility.
Right.
That's a factor that every investor has to deal with.
Unfortunately, yeah, there's no escaping it.
So how would a major economic downturn impact a company like WisdomTree?
Well, one of the biggest things is that their assets under management could decline.
Okay, and how would that affect their bottom line?
Well, it would directly hit their fee revenue.
Right, because their fees are calculated based on the assets they manage.
Exactly. And when their earnings take a hit, their stock price usually follows.
It's a chain reaction.
It is. And even though they have that dividend focus, which, offers some stability during those turbulent times, they're still not completely immune to those bigger market forces.
Right, diversification is always key.
Always.
And speaking of diversification, they do have that really impressive global reach that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, they're all over the world.
So how does that global presence play into their risk management strategy?
Well, having operations in multiple regions is a great way to cushion the blow if one particular region is struggling.
Okay.
So, for example, if the U.S. market is having a tough time, their business in Europe or Asia might be doing better.
It's like having a diversified portfolio, but on a company-wide level.
Exactly. They're not putting all their eggs in one basket.
And it also gives them access to different growth opportunities, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
They're not just relying on the U.S. economy for their success.
So global diversification really acts as both a shield and a sword.
It does.
We talked a bit about those corporate governance issues before the break.
Yeah.
How much should potential investors be concerned about that?
Well, it's definitely something to keep in mind. Conflicts between major shareholders and the board can create a lot of uncertainty.
Right. It can make investors nervous.
And it raises questions about leadership and the direction of the company.
And I imagine it can also erode investor trust.
Absolutely, because if investors don't feel like the company is being well managed, they're going to be less likely to invest their money.
Right. So it's not just about having a good product or a clever strategy.
It goes beyond that.
You have to have that strong foundation of good corporate governance.
Exactly. Things like transparency, accountability, making sure that everyone's interests are aligned.
So it really comes back to that balancing act that we were talking about before.
Yeah.
Balancing innovation with stability.
They need to be bold and ambitious, but also prudent and responsible.
It's a tough line to walk.
It is a tightrope walk, for sure.
Well, it sounds like WisdomTree is facing some pretty significant challenges.
There were definitely some headwinds.
But they've also got some really interesting opportunities ahead of them.
Yeah, they're in a very dynamic space.
Yeah.
And it's going to be fascinating to see how they navigate it.
Well, let's take another quick break, and then we'll come back and talk about the future of WisdomTree and what investors should be watching for.
Sounds good.
So it really feels like WisdomTree is trying to bridge that gap between traditional finance and the world of blockchain.
Yeah. And that's a pretty ambitious goal.
It is, yeah. It's a lot to take on. But, there's also a lot of skepticism around blockchain in general,
Okay.
Some people see it as a fad or even worse, this risky, unregulated Wild West kind of thing.
Yeah, there's definitely some fear and uncertainty out there.
So how does WisdomTree address those concerns and build that trust with investors who might be a little hesitant to jump on the blockchain bandwagon?
Well, I think education is a huge part of it.
Yeah.
They really need to explain the potential benefits of blockchain technology in a way that everyday people can understand.
Less jargon, more real-world examples.
Exactly. Show people how blockchain can solve real problems and make their lives better.
So, how could they do that?
Well, they could talk about how tokenized assets can make it easier for people to invest in things like real estate.
Okay.
Fractional ownership, things like that.
Yeah, that's a great example.
And they also need to be upfront about the risks.
Oh, yeah. Transparency is key.
Absolutely. They need to show that they're working with regulators to make sure that everything is done safely and responsibly.
So it's not just about being innovative. It's also about being trustworthy.
Exactly. And building that trust is so important, especially in a field like blockchain where there's still so much uncertainty.
Right. Investors need to know that their money is in good hands.
Absolutely.
So let's zoom out a little bit and talk about WisdomTree's vision for the future of finance. What does that world look like to them?
Well, I think they see a future where finance is more inclusive and efficient and accessible to everyone.
Okay.
And they believe that blockchain technology is a key part of making that happen.
So it's about empowering investors.
Exactly. Giving them more control over their assets, more transparency, and more opportunities.
It's a pretty compelling vision.
It is.
But of course, we've talked about all those challenges that they're facing, the competition, the regulation, the market volatility.
There's no shortage of hurdles to overcome.
So what should investors be watching? What are the key indicators that WisdomTree is actually on the right track here?
Well, first of all, they need to keep innovating. They can't afford to just rest on their laurels. They need to be constantly pushing the boundaries, coming up with new products and services.
They need to stay ahead of the curve.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they also need to make progress on the regulatory front.
Right.
They need to get those approvals for their blockchain initiatives, build those relationships with regulators, and really establish themselves as a leader in responsible blockchain innovation.
Okay, so they're not just playing by the rules, they're actually helping to write them.
In a way, yes. And of course, they need to show that their strategy is actually working.
Right.
They need to deliver consistent financial performance, attract assets, generate value for shareholders.
So the proof is in the pudding, as they say.
Exactly. Ultimately, investors will decide whether WisdomTree's vision is worth buying into.
But it certainly sounds like they're off to a promising start.
They've got a lot of potential.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, from their diverse portfolio to their blockchain ventures, their global reach, their dividend focus, and of course, all those risks and challenges.
It's been a really comprehensive deep dive.
I hope you, our listeners, have a much clearer picture of WisdomTree now and whether they might be a good fit for your investment goals.
And remember, investing is a personal journey. Do your own research, think about your risk tolerance, and make decisions that are right for you.
That's great advice. Thank you so much for joining us today on this deep dive into WisdomTree.
It's been a pleasure.
And remember, the world of finance is constantly changing. So stay curious, stay informed, and never stop learning.
Absolutely.
Until next time,